everyone, and welcome to Talk Nerdy. Today is Monday, March 4th, 2024, and I'm the host of the show, Cara Santa Maria. And as always, before we dive into this week's episode, I do want to thank those of you who make Talk Nerdy possible. You may or may have not noticed that this is our, ninth episode of the year. And of course, I've only sold one ad slot. So clearly the support of the show lately, because of the way that ad sales are going with podcasting, is relying heavily on listener support just like you. It's always been the main model of support for the show, but now more than ever, it is pretty important. So if you're interested in pledging your support, using this sort of like NPR PBS model, all you've got to do is visit patreon.com/talknerdy. You can pledge as little as a few cents if you want to. I don't know if I would do that because of processing fees, but as few as $1 or something like that per episode. And it really does go a super long way. This week's top patrons include Daniel Lang, David J.E. Smith, Mary Neva, Brian Holden, David Compton, Gabrielle F. Jaramillo, Joe Wilkinson, Pasquale Gelati, and Riva Keith and Ulrika Hagman. Thank you all so much from the bottom of my heart. All right, let's dive into this week's episode. So, I had the opportunity to speak with Dr. Barbara D. Savage, a historian and the Geraldine R. Siegel Professor of American Social Thought at the University of Pennsylvania. She has a new book out called Merze, Tate, The Global Odyssey of a Black Woman Scholar. And she recently won the Association for the Study of African American Life and History Best Book Award for 2024 for this very book that we're going to dive into. So without any further ado, here she is, Dr. Barbara Savage. Well, Barbara, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you so much for the invitation. Really looking forward to talking with you.
Yeah, so this is, I love having these kinds of conversations on the show. I don't do them very often, but I am always fascinated by the history of science, the history of influential people in academia, the history of scholarship, and especially the confluence, obviously, of these different social pressures and just, conversations about how we got to where we are, where we're continuing to go. And so I'm always excited when I have individuals on the show who are not just historians like yourself, but also just incredible writers and authors who bring that history to life. So before we get into the book itself, I would love to hear a little bit more about your path and journey. Like, how does one become a historian?
Well, I am a historian fully by choice, in the sense that, like many people who went to college in the late 1970s, I took a detour first to law school. I did that inspired in part by the example of really heroic lawyers during the civil rights movement, which was my childhood. And so after going to law school and spending about a decade, a little bit more in Washington, working on Capitol Hill and at the Children's Defense Fund, I realized how much I wanted to write and how I was still drawn to history, and particularly to African American history. So I made a decision in my mid-30s to go to graduate school to study history, and was was able to do that. Felt privileged to be able to do it, and so I think I come to this work with a great deal of a sense of purpose and mission, and always wanting to write African American history, which I still believe was both understudied and misunderstood, and hope that as a writer and a researcher and as a teacher, that I could continue to advance what we know about Black history in this country. And so I have brought to it, everything that I am, including someone who came to it in midlife or after having done something else. So that's the short story. I grew up in Virginia, and as I said, time in Washington, it still keeps me with an interest in politics and history and the relationship between race and media and politics and history. And certainly, as I've continued to be in the profession myself, been very much aware of the difficulties, particularly for Black women who also want to enter this field and do this kind of work. And in many ways, I think all of those concerns kind of come together in this biography of Merce Tate.
Yeah. So, it's obviously one cannot grapple with and tell stories about Black history without grappling with politics, right? Without grappling with the political nature of kind of the American experience. But one thing that interests me a lot is the kind of special focus that you have had in your career on the stories of Black women. And so I'm curious, because gosh, when we talk about, I come from a psychology background, right? So I just finished my PhD in psychology, again, like late in life, kind of did a mid-career shift as well. And I usually have that lens, right? And so what I know about kind of race relations, race studies, and specifically when we talk about African American history, but also women's history, that confluence there, just that across the board, it's the, how do I word this? It's the raw end of the political stick, right? And I think that conversation is such an important conversation because very often we talk about race or we talk about gender, but we don't talk about the intersectionality of the two.
And that's, I think, a really important point and a really important place to begin, because as a Black woman scholar writing about a Black woman scholar, as I do in this book, I there were certainly very familiar resonances with me, things that were very legible to me, because even though Merce Tate and I are separated by half a century in terms of time, there was a great deal of familiarity. I mean, you're right that I've spent a fair amount of time talking about and writing and researching Black women. One of my original interests actually was in politics and religion and African American women. And so I had done some earlier work there looking at the relationship between religion and politics through the lens of Black women who were working inside religious organizations or outside of them and criticizing them, but really trying to elevate them into that story. And that then carried over into a collaborative project that I was really privileged to be a part of on Black women intellectuals, because African American intellectual history has been dominated as a field by men who are very deserving, who did extraordinary things and are very gifted and important figures, Du Bois and others. But I have tried, and we tried in that project to say, hold up, wait a minute. There are also all of these women who may not have had access to doctoral level training or may not have been able to get published in the same way, but were nonetheless doing intellectual history wherever they were, and that their ideas, whether they're expressed in print or in speeches or in essays, are just as significant and just as important and deserve to be a part of these ongoing conversations about, as you say, about race and gender and about politics and race. And so that's been, I think, a theme in my work, and it's something I've also brought to my teaching, in the sense that you certainly want to make sure that when you're presenting this history, that it also reflects kind of the broad spectrum of African American life and people. And students respond very, very well to that, because they are being raised in a world where there is greater attention to gender, but never enough, I don't think. And so there's a great deal of receptivity to it. So yeah, it is something that I care about very deeply, and it is out of that work on Black women intellectuals that this interest in the current project has came to me. And so I think that we see this every day in terms of the sort of current political realm and certainly academic politics right now, and the difficulties that Black women in particular are facing. And so it is a story, sadly, that continues in that realm, and something that we need to be continue to be attentive to, and also to realize that there are all of these historical antecedents as well.
Yeah, and before we get into Merce and her story, I feel like there's something that you mentioned that's sort of implicit but does bear repeating and making explicit, which is this the importance of these conversations around the history of a people whose history is often not documented to the extent that the history of those around them are, right? So I think it's an oversimplification to kind of say that like history is written by people used to say the victor. I like to say the powerful, those who have, power. But it's such an important thing to go back and to do the excavation to tell the stories of the people who very often were not there in the numbers that they should have been, but were there and just they didn't win the prizes. They didn't win the awards. Sometimes they didn't get the degrees and they didn't have any of the documentation necessarily. Their stories weren't the ones being told, but they were there nonetheless.
And that's certainly the case with Professor Tate. But I think more broadly in African American women's history, one of the kind of recurring tropes there is this notion of silence and absence. That somehow this history has not received the attention it has deserved because the sources aren't there to support it, or they're not represented in the ways that we're normally expecting to find historical figures. And I think part of what I try to demonstrate in this work and in other work I've done is that yes, there are in fact archives that are available and they're waiting to be tapped into to try to broaden our understanding of African American women's history and their contributions, to American history. And so that is, and I think as we get closer to talking about the book, I think you will find that there are many women like Professor Tate who, in their lifetimes, were very well known and very accomplished, but somehow are then erased from the institutional histories and the broader histories. Even someone who is as prominent as she was in her lifetime, and that erasure is itself a result of people looking in the usual places for the usual suspects, to say this is what history should look like. These are the people who should be included. And I'm hoping that with this work and the work of lots of other scholars right now, that we're just saying this array of figures is much broader, much richer, much deeper, and much more interesting if we're able to bring to life again people who were very important in their lifetime. So that is one of the things that I try to do here, and certainly one of the things I encourage my students to do is to be patient enough to look beyond the usual names and to dig around just like an investigative reporter does, to look for interesting moments, interesting people, and to use that as a way of building stories and narratives that will capture a broader interest and serve to illustrate this really rich history that we all share.
Yeah, I think as a historian, it must be almost like a two-pronged approach. Like there's the history itself, and then there's the meta action of contextualizing not just the history at the time, but the how do I put this? The way that the history was sometimes buried or suppressed. And so this is what was happening then, but this is why you've never heard of this before, and these were all the things that led to me being able to tell you this story right now. I feel like that component of it must be like there are whole dissertations just in that layer.
Yeah, and it's interesting that you should raise that, because when I talk about Tate and other figures as well, but in this case about Tate, people are often apologetic to say, "I never heard of her. I didn't know about it. I'm so sorry." And this is across the board. It doesn't matter whether I've spoken about her in very many wide audiences, both here in the U.S. and abroad. And I say, it's not your fault. I didn't know until I started doing the work on her. And so it is this notion of history being, as you say, suppressed or buried, and this kind of excavation work that historians do to kind of bring these lives and these moments back to the fore. But it's also important to then say, and here's the broader context of that life as it was lived, and here's why this life is still so important for us to know about, and what it is that this one life can still teach us. And that way, there's a political context, but there's also a way to show the continued relevancy of the lives of these women in particular, whose actions and work and writings and lives have been erased.
And of course, Merce's life really does fit beautifully into that context that you described, just simply from um, an era perspective, right? Because she spanned, I mean, her life spanned so many different political movements, so many different changes here in America and abroad. So, the book, the subheading of the book is The Global Odyssey of a Black Woman Scholar. And there's this beautiful black and white image of her in the front, sort of in her regalia on a bicycle, in front of, is this Oxford? Ooh, I should probably know that.
No, it is It's Oxford.
Okay.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Okay. And so you have this sort of juxtaposition, right, of an African American woman who's studying abroad and who is in this sort of obvious academic attire in an era when that probably wasn't very typical. So talk to me about the context first of her life. When was she born? When did she die? What was kind of contemporaneous to that time?
Yes, she was born in 1905 and died in 1996. So her life almost literally spans the entire 20th century, which I can tell you was a big challenge for me, because the longer she lived, the more work I had to do in order to sustain that narrative. And the real challenge of trying to contextualize what's going on in the 1920s and 30s and 40s and 50s in a way that is sufficient to help a reader understand, but without overwhelming the story itself. So it's a very tricky balance. But she's a woman who was born in 1905 in rural Michigan, and to a family of Black homesteaders there. And she is born and raised there, and is able to get a very good education, especially for a black student at that time. And she takes full advantage of every opportunity that comes her way. And so we see her, as I argue in the book, also being a child of World War One. Those are her earliest kind of public memories, fed by reading newspapers, but also by family members who serve in the war and come home with stories of what it's like to be abroad. And so we see her then moving through, the 20s and the 30s. She begins to travel herself to Europe and elsewhere in that period. We see her grappling with all of the issues that are raised during World War II, in particular about Black men serving in segregated armed services and being sent overseas to fight, and yet still come back and be treated as less less than Americans here. Every decade we can use her life to learn about anti-imperialism in the 1950s, the civil rights movement in the 60s, African, independence movements in the 60s and 70s. You name it, she's there. And so I have tried in the book to use her life as a way to take us through that history, but still, obviously, still to be talking about what it is that she's doing and what she's writing and where she's going and what she's thinking. But it was a real challenge as a first-time biographer to figure out how to do that. It taught me this. I understand now why people write 400, 600, and 800-page biographies. I did not do that because you can, in fact, follow every tributary, and you end up with a book that has that kind of tome. And I tried to be a little bit more judicious in my approach to her life. But it was a tremendous opportunity to review that history. And I say that especially as someone who's taught 20th century African American history for 25 or 30 years, and then to have this person just kind of plop down in all of these moments, and just to see that in a certain kind of reality through one person's life. So that was one of the most interesting, challenging, and compelling aspects of doing the work.
Yeah, and I can imagine, it's funny that you mentioned these sort of like tomes, and I'm a sucker for a Ken Burns documentary, and so I will spend like hours of my life dedicated to that. But I know that is, it's a particular taste, and not everybody, and even that is documentary form, not book form. And so this is not a Ken Burns book. It's definitely readable and much more accessible, I think, in so many ways. But one thing that I guess I, you tell me if you even want to go there, but one thing that I'm thinking about is how we are not just what happened while we were alive and we were affecting history, but we are products of the immediate sort of precursors of our parents, of the era in which we were first born. I personally was born in the Reagan era, but I don't remember Reagan. I don't remember Reagan's policies. And I know about them because I learned them in school, but I was born into that. And so I think about somebody like Merce, who she came at a time in history that I don't think that most white people think about. I think they think, okay, there's like, slavery for all this time in American history, and then the Civil War, and then it was like, then Jim Crow. And they forget about Reconstruction, and they forget about this era that's very complicated. And I think when we think about like rural Michigan, like the Midwest at the turn of the century, a lot of people might not, I know I didn't really know the context of like what was life like for a Black family in 1900, 1905
Yes.
when she was born.
Yeah, and I think I think you're touching on something really important. I think one of the things that I learned again in trying to do a biographical project is that I had to embed her in her family history, because you're absolutely right. It doesn't control, but it definitely influences, and it definitely is the foundation for who she becomes. And so, as I said, she's born in 1905 into this family that is in the middle of nowhere in Michigan, because her family had moved west from Ohio and Pennsylvania to be able to take advantage of the Homestead Act of 1862, to be a little on the nerdy side there. But the idea is that if they could get there, they could get land, they could farm it, they could build for themselves. And this is at a time, when that was not, being able to own land and to farm, especially, and she would say this herself, that being born in Michigan rather than Mississippi made all the difference in the world for her, for many reasons. One of which is what she meant initially, was that her parents were not sharecroppers. They were actually Black people who were able to, they were not wealthy by any means, but were able to have a subsistence existence there and to take care of themselves, but also to have that pride of ownership and independence. And it also means that when they traveled there, her family had been free before the Civil War. When they were in Ohio and Pennsylvania, they were free Black people, but they still sought more financial, possibility by moving west. And I also have come to see her as a child of the Midwest, which is a region that usually doesn't stand alone. When I teach African American history, people just want to talk about the North and the South, the North and the South.
Yep.
But the
Yeah.
Midwest, but the Midwest is its own entity, and I've really come to respect that history so much more, having had to learn it in order to place her. So she's born in Michigan, and then moves south to Indianapolis to get a teaching job as a high school history teacher, because she can't, as a Black woman, she can't get that job in her home state of Michigan, but she moves south to Indianapolis and teaches at an all Black high school there. And that is, it's a very prominent and lively Black urban community that's often overlooked in our rush to talk about New York and Chicago. Here is this whole other way of being that I've just really had to come to appreciate. And so, Tate is unusual in that way because she veers from the usual the usual categories, the usual paths of migration. And for each of those things that are somehow exceptional, she is still nonetheless living out in some ways, also very typical life of an African American woman in this period, an African American woman with access to education and someone who's imagining what a modern Black womanhood might look for her, and which is also a very privileged position, from which to dream. And so, through hard work and determination, she's able to push from Indianapolis to Oxford and then to get a degree there in international relations in the mid 1930s, when access to that kind of training here was all but foreclosed for women and for Black women in particular. So I just say all of that to say you're absolutely right. I give a lot of credit to her family and her upbringing, and that fierce sense of independence and possibility which they then gave to her.
Yeah, sort of fostered in her. I'm curious about this concept, and I know I'm maybe getting a little bit meta here, but as it relates to her life, hopefully you can also give us some examples. But this concept of sort of being in a privileged position, but also that privilege not being foregone, right? Like she was, let's say, financially or just culturally, and maybe I'm talking about the microcosmic culture of her own family, but culturally, her independence and her curiosity was fostered, and she was privileged enough to be able to travel and to be able to, go to these different places to be able to learn. But at the same time, there were not a lot of people, right, who looked like her doing these things, and like she had to leave places where she didn't have that kind of opportunity in order to seek those opportunities. So I'm curious about this juxtaposition of being in a privileged position, but also a very disadvantaged position, sort of at the same time, or needing to be a trailblazer to provide privilege for those who follow her.
Yes, and I think you're touching on exactly a paradox and a juxtaposition, because she is relatively privileged, certainly compared to other African American women and other African Americans. And actually, to have a college education and begin to have graduate degrees at that point, she's actually more privileged than many white people at that point,
Mm-hmm.
too. But
And
I
definitely
think
women. Yeah.
and
Yeah.
definitely women. But I
Mm-hmm.
think that you're absolutely right that for her and for many Black people, men and women of that era, with this privilege comes this also tremendous sense of responsibility and of the responsibility to represent, to both, because they see themselves as trailblazers and as also trying to demonstrate over and over and over and over again, yes, I'm smart enough to be here. Yes, I'm capable of doing this work. Yes, I can do this. And yes, I'm as capable, and if not more capable than you are. But also this notion that if they should fail, if they should falter, if they should make a mistake, if they should do something unseemly, that it would not just be a reflection on her and her possibilities, but it would be a reflection on the entire race of Black people, and also especially on other Black women, and she felt that very keenly and spoke about it poignantly when she was at, whether she was at Oxford or later at Radcliffe. But I think all of her life, this notion that you're always, and I call it the burden of racial representation. But there's also an opportunity there too to pave the way, as you say, for people to follow. I mean, I see myself as a beneficiary of the kind of sacrifices and work and example of people like Tate, not just her, but people who basically, came into these opportunities, made the best of them that they could. I've had much greater privilege and much greater sense of possibilities, but their example of stepping up, stepping in, and trying to make the best possible use of whatever opportunities come your way. I think that that's the example that I certainly, see in her life and many, many other lives.
Yeah, and you touched on something about intersectionality that I find um really interesting and sort of difficult to grapple with. Obviously, I am a white woman. I'm a Latina white woman, but I present obviously very, very white, Puerto Rican, and I'm a woman, and I have other components to my, whatever. Everybody has their descriptions, right? I'm an atheist, and I'm unmarried, and I'm child free, and all these different things. And one of my dear friends is an Afro Caribbean woman, and so we talk often, we dig deep a little bit into this concept of intersectionality and the times in her life when she grapples with, she's like, I'm Black and I'm a woman, but I'm also a Black woman, which is different than being Black or being a woman. And when I think of Merce, she was born into an era of quote unquote freedom, but then immediately was thrust into this sort of Jim Crow era. But like, she was not born with the privilege of the vote, for example. But when you think about women's suffrage in this country, and you think about how some of the people at the bleeding edge of the women's suffrage movement were Black women, but they were minimized by their white peers, right? Their voices were actively being silenced by their white peers because they didn't see them as being, quote, helpful to the movement, even though these were the women who were very often spearheading the movement. And so this idea of being a woman in this era, but maybe not fully identifying with the women that you're surrounded by in academia, and being Black in this era, but not fully identifying with the Black men that you're surrounded by in academia, must have been, gosh, there's so many adjectives I could use, but I'm curious how you might
Yes,
describe that
I
experience.
think part of what you're touching on is this. There's a great deal of freedom actually in not having a role model, and let me explain. What I mean in the sense that she is an example, a tremendous example of self-invention and self-creation. In that, when she was going to school and to college and to graduate school, there were no other older Black women at Oxford. There weren't older Black women with doctorates and professorships. And so she is imagining herself stepping into a role for which there are no models. And in that way, that actually can be very freeing. I mean, obviously, you're having to battle the kind of oppressive expectations that people have and limitations. But if you refuse to accept that in the sense of limiting your own vision of yourself and what you are and what you can become, there is actually some liberation in that, which is not to say it was easy. It was not. But what I find interesting in her life, and you're talking about the suffrage movement and the discrimination and racism within that movement, which she, would have been aware of, she always credited her success, and she was correct in this way, with the generosity of older women, both black and white. And I think that's one of the things that struck me as unusual in her life, that women deployed the limited resources they had on her behalf, because they could see all of this genius and determination, and they people wanted to help her realize that ambition which she had. And so she is one of the rare examples, I think, of kind of an interracial cooperation, in the period of, during her life. But her models, I think, for her life really were other engaged, strong, independent Black women who were not, without delicacy, and not, without their own vulnerabilities, but Black women who had found a way to serve their communities, to become what they wanted to become within the limitations of Jim Crow and segregation and discrimination, but who were able to hold on to a tremendous sense of self-worth and also racial commitment. And she also was not someone without her own ego, and also a boldness about her, and a willingness to fight for what she thought was right for herself and for other people. And so she kind of brought it took all of that, frankly, for her to achieve the success that she was, that she was later to see in her life. But basically, these were women who did not give up and who refused to accept the narrow boundaries and categories that people wanted to put them in. And for that, I'm just really grateful for her example, and that of many, many other, women of her generation.
Yeah, you mentioned just trying to again like kind of tap into my own empathy for the historical period and for the experience that she, let's say, at home and abroad. I'm curious, and maybe you can help us with the timeline too, like when did she leave? At what point in her education did she leave and then come back? But at home and abroad, was she like the only Black woman that she saw? Was it like, just like you said, super minimal representation? And beyond that, was she mostly, if you were to think about that intersectionality, surrounded by Black men? Or was she mostly, so I mean, obviously she was mostly surrounded by white men, but beyond that, was it more Black men or more white women that would have been sort of the template around her?
Yes, just to move through that quickly, if we think about the institutions that trained her, what's unusual is that, of course, when she went to even in elementary, secondary school, and then college at Western Michigan, she was one of the only Black women in those classes. So she was surrounded by white people, including other white women there. When she went to Oxford in the 30s, of course, this is a time when there were very, very, very few women at Oxford. She was the only Black American woman in the entire university, but was befriended by the small group of white women who were there. And so she is in this white male institution, but surviving in the enclave of other women. In this case, most of them are white. And when she leaves Oxford and then comes back to the United States and rides a Jim Crow train south to North Carolina, where she taught first at Bennett College, which is an all Black women's college in North Carolina. There she is she's in a pretty much an all female Black setting for that period, and then goes to Radcliffe and Harvard to get her doctorate, where once again she's surrounded primarily by white men and a small enclave of white women within the university. So it is not until she gets to Howard University in the mid 1940s that she's actually in a Black institution that is dominated by Black men, where there are very strong, interesting, formidable, brilliant Black women there. She's not the only Black woman there. But the administration, the deans, and the presidents, the people who are running the institution are, of course, men. And I give Howard full credit for hiring women to the faculty at a time when other institutions were not doing that. And so and she was very grateful for that opportunity and spent the rest of her career there. But in that case, we do see her, literally tussling with the men in the institution who she thought were basically playing favorites with, like an old boys network, if I might, kind of put it that way. But the other thing about her career as a scholar is that this is a woman who is studying international relations and diplomatic history, who's an expert on disarmament, and just all of these categories of knowledge that very, very, very few women are engaged in. They're, for the most part, that's the province of white men, foreign affairs, international relations. So in terms of her work and the fields that she's trying to break into, she runs then, smack into the white men who control publishing and recognition and book reviews, and even just figuring out how to get into print. And at each of those turns where she's successful, there is some woman somewhere trying to deploy whatever power she has to, again, assist and help. And so that's the really interesting thing to me, is that women, including white women, had such limited access to power themselves, but it is reassuring to see them basically trying to mentor and help, in this case, Tate, but others along the way. That's a long and wandering digression a little bit, but
Oh no, but
just to
yeah, it's so
capture that
helpful.
dynamic. So she's not really in a Black male dominated institution until she arrives at Howard. And that changes during the course of her career there. Of course, she comes there in the 40s and retires in the late 70s. And by then, of course, there are Black women who are deans and have more authority, although she would still say that the men are still favored. And she would not be wrong about that. And I say that as someone, who entered academic politics in the 90s, and that was also still the case.
Oh, it's still the case today. I mean, it and that's, I think, such an important kind of concept, especially for those listening. I have it's interesting because I started this show almost 10 years ago now with actually 10 years ago now, with like a very hard science entry, because that's what I used to do. I was a neuroscientist before I got into psychology. And I don't know if it's because of that or whatever. Long story short, I have a predominantly male listenership, which I find bizarre because I almost exclusively have women on the show. And so it's really interesting to see that. But what I find is this sort of the point that I'm getting to here is that sometimes when we look at things through historical lens and how that historical lens bleeds into the present, especially when we're talking about race in this country, there's sort of an overt manifestation of racism, right? Like we can talk about segregation, we can talk about the Jim Crow South, we can talk about these very obvious examples. When we talk about gender, I worry that the patriarchy has been largely invisible. And maybe when we talk about somebody like Merze, we're like, oh, right, because it's the 40s and the cult of domesticity, but she's not really doing that. She's an academic. So she's not sort of shackled by that normativity. It's like, no, she was still living in an era where women were fully capable, as we learned during the war, to do anything and everything. Yet then the minute the war was over, it was like, no, go back to the kitchen. And so this was like a really, and that patriarchy continues, obviously. It's sort of invisibility continues. But she lived during a very overt version of that I wonder if it was often not minimized, but sort of hidden by the race
No, yeah,
component that is
I
out in the
see what you're
front.
saying. I think though, if you really have
Yeah.
I think the clearest understanding of intersectionality and kind of related concepts is the inseparability, if you will, of race and class and gender. And so, what I would say, to that is that yes, she certainly uh, felt the power of uh, of of kind of the focused on men and the acceptance of men as leaders and as embodying a particular kind of excellence that was the same thing that she was herself trying to achieve. But we also you see her kind of refusing to accept that, and she also made a decision at some point. She never married. And also never had children, and I do see that as a decision and not as not as a some that she was thwarted from those things. I think she made a decision, and so she's also a woman who's living in a world where marriage brings a certain kind of status, so that your attachment to a male partner and being married, including and maybe even particularly among in African American communities, but this notion of being sort of twinned with your male partner in terms of status and access socially, politically, professionally. And she did not have the benefit of having a male partner. And yet she was welcomed by other Black women into that social world. So she was not, rendered lonely or alone. But I also have a very difficult time imagining her being able to go to India in 1950, 1951 on a Fulbright for a year and travel all around there in Asia, or to circle the globe twice, solo, by herself, alone, traveling, or to be able to make time to write 5 books and publish 24, articles, to do her academic work, to travel as widely as she did, to live the life that she wanted to live. It's difficult for me to imagine in that era for her how she would have been able to do that if she had chosen to be in a traditional marriage, or if she had had the responsibilities of childcare in a particular kind of way. And so for her, or for someone like her, that may have been a necessary choice. It's not so much the case now. It is possible to do all of those things if you find the right partner and can share responsibilities. So you can imagine that working out. But I think for the kind of independent woman that she was, it's difficult for me to imagine her in a much more traditional kind of role as wife or mother, and being able to become the person that she wanted to become.
Yeah, that double-edged sword is fascinating to me. Kind of this, it brings me to these very existential places, which is what most of my studies are in, of like not freedom from, but freedom to, right? Like she had the freedom to be able to follow these different kind of goals and endeavors, but at the same time, you mentioned it, and I think it bears repeating. Marriage at the time was a currency, and especially in academia. I have interviewed many older women physicists who got their first professorship position as a come along with their husband. Like this was not uncommon. Like because their husband got a professorship, they worked into their contract that their wives could also come to the university because no women were professors at the time.
And I think it particularly in fields like science, but also in other fields, as well, that makes all the sense in the world, to me, for those early generations of women academics. And so she's there, finding a way and she writes about it and talks about it early on. And even in the 1930s, she's kind of imagining the kind of possibilities for Black women she's training in the 30s and 40s, and seeing the possibility that they could have access to professions that their parent or mothers would never have had access to, but that they might also want to be married and might also want to have children. Or for those who didn't, she was trying to find a way to say that's not a bad thing. That doesn't mean that we're, old maids, or all of the kind of dismissive things that were applied to women who chose to remain single and to become professions. So she's trying to figure out, how do you train women so they can pursue whatever professional ambitions they have, but also protect the opportunities for them to marry if they choose, or be coupled and have children or not, and yet be that there's a pathway, for a kind of modern Black womanhood that allows for all of those variations, which we now see now, but not without. Being single at that point was a stigma. It was
Right.
stigmatized, and
Yeah. Yeah. I
so
mean, it still is, but like
it
definitely
is
worse
in that
than.
period when it was the expected thing. And also when, we think of marriage and love and romance, but marriage is also an economic relationship. And so those two coupled households, there was a tremendous amount of economic advantage to that as well. So, and she did not have that herself.
Yeah, back to the push pull again. She had to, it was all on her shoulders, yet at the same time, she was never going to be a doctor and Mrs. She got to be doctor, because even if she had been doctor with a man, she might have still been the Mrs. And I think that that's a context that's often forgotten that we still see to this day.
Exactly. And so she was always, very proud of what she had achieved. And as I said, was not shy about expressing that and claiming it. And I admire that in her. Those are traits that are still frowned upon in women today. And yet she was pretty strong and clear, and had a tremendous amount of ego strength to support her own views about what was best for her.
Yeah. And so, we've spent, and this is so my way, so I apologize in advance, but I love just like getting into the gray and getting into the context and setting a scene and painting a picture because, of course, we're not reading the book on air, right? Like I want to get people into the era so that then when they pick the book up, they can learn all of the stories and they can experience, all of the twists and turns. But maybe just as a little bit of a spoiler alert, as we're winding down, you can give us some of the greatest hits, just some of the accomplishments, especially of her academic career in this field that you mentioned. She's an expert on nuclear arms. She's an expert on this idea of deproliferation, and I guess de-armament. Like, what was her stance, and where was she sort of publishing in the academic world?
Yes, she was publishing actually at Harvard and Yale, which was very unusual. And her earliest works on disarmament and nuclear proliferation, came under that imprint. I think that her largest and most significant body of work actually had to do with race and anti-imperialism in the Pacific, and in the whole, and she began that work by talking about U.S. imperialism in that region and using Hawaii as her example, and the kind of U.S. interventions there starting in the 1820s, but which eventually result in annexation and statehood, as she was someone who was really, really sensitive to what she called and what others call the darker peoples of the world in the 20th century. And how do we move away from the colonization that had characterized certainly the first half of the 20th century, and move to a freer and more just set of societies for people in the Pacific, in Asia, in India in particular, and then by the end of her career in Africa, as she saw post-independent Africa being vulnerable to a new kind of imperialism that was led by international corporations, many of which were headquartered in the United States. And so if there's a through line in her work, it is that really thinking about the power differences between heavily armed and heavily capitalized nations, including the United States and other imperialist powers, and then how do we move to a freer and more just world, in the 20th century, and I guess, going forward here in the 21st century. And I think as we see, those issues are still really pertinent. She was prescient in all sorts of ways about that, and so her work was, as I said, in her lifetime was recognized as definitive and important and breathtakingly early in many of these ideas. But then she was, as I said, both erased and lost in the rush towards rewriting and writing that intellectual history of the 20th century. And that's part of what I hope to reclaim, in this book for her. And I hope also for other men and women, who suffered the same sort of fate, to say, there's work to be done, and let's dig around and pull these figures back, and let us continue to learn from them in their lives.
Oh, and it's so important, I think, when we look at these different, I guess, levels of granularity, the personal is the political and vice versa, and these sort of microcosms of individual lives, how often these individuals who couldn't help but understand the context from which they were navigating their own lives, and to make that leap or to connect those dots to the larger concepts of, like you said, imperialism and capitalism and colonialism, that this, African American woman who grew up during all of the, during women's suffrage, during the Jim Crow era, during all of these really important sort of political movements, is also prescient about like the genocide that's happening right now in Gaza, right? About these different, global scenarios that tend to recapitulate over and over and over. What an important message for anybody right now.
Yes, and I'll just say this as well to speak to this point about her, is that she also had what I call in the book an engineer's mind. She was very scientifically oriented, very great at mathematics, but also really intrigued by large technological projects, whether dams or other kinds of electrification projects. And so her mastery of the technologies of imperialism, whether it's armaments, or in Africa, she saw railroads and deep sea ports as tools of imperialism, but she brought to all of that work a deep appreciation for and understanding of the relationship between technology and race and imperialism. And that's something we've gotten more sensitive about really rather recently. But I also would see her as, as just having a particularly kind of scientifically oriented mind. And you find that in the work itself. And that's one of the reasons that these fields that she worked in had been so heavily identified as male, quote unquote, because they really did require a fair amount of scientific mastery to be able to write about them, even in an international relations and diplomatic history context. And she reveled in that. And so she would appreciate the work that you're doing on this show. But I always just like to say that she basically, had an engineer's mind, a
I love
problem
that
solver.
too.
Yeah.
Because it's honestly, it's so rare, like working in a field that's very kind of skeptically oriented and very scientifically minded, but also being very interested from a psychology perspective in indigenous practices and in sort of this like decolonizing approach to understanding human psychology and relationships. It's complicated because a lot of my peers in the sort of scientific skeptic movement, I do believe, have an oversimplified view that sort of science and technology will save us all. And it's sort of the indigenous practices versus modern science or
Yeah.
technology.
And
And
that's
that's, it's not that simple.
No, it's very short-sighted too. And
Yeah.
I think also at the end of the 1940s, she was already advocating for African American students to study science and technology and engineering because, and you could speak to this perhaps, because she thought that those fields, if Black students were able to excel there, that somehow the quantifiable nature of those fields would make it easier in a way for people to recognize and appreciate good work, worthy work, and somehow it might be not as subjective as other fields, and there might be avenues for success there for Black students if they could get access to that training. But she was saying that in the late 1940s, before we knew the concept of STEM. But
Yeah,
that
or
was
even just like decolonizing science. Like that's such an
exactly,
interesting, because I
yeah,
think so many people misunderstand what that movement is. And they think it's about like getting rid of the scientific method or making everything postmodern. And it's like, no, it's about having the voices in there that should have been in there from the beginning that are sensitive to the potential dangers. And I say the latent potential dangers of technology and science, not that they're intrinsically dangerous, but that unchecked without the moral component and without the intersectional component, like when you don't have women in the room, when you don't have individuals of color in the room, those perspectives are lost, obviously.
and that's actually one of the things I say in the book more broadly is that when you think about people who've done the academic work and the intellectual work that Tate has done, but it's been lost to us. If we think of all the people who did not have the privilege and the opportunity that she had to be trained and to do that work, if we think about that sort of taken together, how much we all have lost from not having access to that work, for not having access to that potential work that some, brilliant person could have done given the opportunity, that the loss is really ours and the tragedy is really ours. And so I think it's really important to be able to reclaim someone like Tate who made, through hard work and determination and her own brilliance, but who took advantage of every opportunity she had. But nonetheless, her work was then lost to us, lost to me as a scholar and as a teacher. And so that's the real tragedy. And so recuperating that work and reintegrating it and broadening out what we think we know and understand about whatever field this is a moment where I think that's really, really important to be able to do.
What an important point, and I think a really good point to kind of close us out on this idea that sort of the trajectory has often been set by these historically powerful people, and those who were oppressed didn't get to have as much influence on the trajectory of whatever we're talking about. And I think sometimes it may feel like it's hopeless, like we can't change a trajectory, but I do think that doing the work to go back and excavate these stories and then reintegrating the lessons from these stories and the empowerment that come from these stories into the narrative today does have quite an impact on the trajectory. And that's not to say that the patriarchy isn't powerful, right? That's not to say that white supremacy isn't incredibly powerful in our country, but it is to say that it's not a foregone conclusion and that we can learn from the past in order to continue to put pressure on the future to move that trajectory. And when you move that angle just the tiniest bit, right? We think about it from a physics perspective, like asteroid deflection or something like that. Just the tiniest little change and the course becomes dramatically different. And I think that's an important perspective to maintain.
Yes, and I think we all also need to be holding on, to our own commitments to make it less hard for people like Tate, to make it less difficult, to make it easier, and to open these opportunities to those who are willing to do the work and who have the abilities to do it, and to be still engaged in the project of trying to do that and to move beyond the kind of usual places that we look for genius and for brilliance.
Here. Well, everybody, the book is Merze Tate, The Global Odyssey of a Black Woman Scholar by Dr. Barbara D. Savage. Barbara, thank you so much for spending so much time with us today, for enlightening us about this woman's, incredible story, and for really just kind of inspiring these important conversations.
Well, thank you very much. It was my privilege to talk with you. Keep up the good work.
Thank you. And everybody listening, thank you for coming back week after week. I'm really looking forward to the next time we all get together to talk learning.